started, if you haven't yet, in the chat box, tell us where you're joining from. And if you are an NEC member, what org are you from? And most importantly, we want to know, why are you here to join us today for this circle?
We've got a bunch of folks just connecting right now. So as you're joining, you'll see we're sharing our answers to a question in the chat box that's on the slide. If you don't see the chat box, look for a button that says chat in your toolbar and click that chat button so you can join in with what other folks are sharing in the chat.
So we're going to let you keep those coming in the chat. And I just want to introduce myself. My name is Joe Talbert, and I work at People's Hub as the Circles and Strategy Clinics Coordinator. And today, as the moderator, I will be helping to facilitate our conversation. And our conversation today will focus on the New Economy Coalition's platform. And we have some great folks joining us today that I want to introduce you to. So if we can go to the next slide. We have Siobhan, Interim Co-Director of the New Economy Coalition. We have Yasi from Sustainable Economies Law Center. And we have Renee joining us from Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic. And so they have a lot of good information to tell us that I know they can't wait to share with you. And so I just want to say thank you to the tech support who is there to help you with anything that may arise during our time together. And you can ask your questions to the folks in the chat labeled tech support. Next slide. So People's Hub is an online platform that helps individuals, organizations, and communities have increased capacity and agency to craft their vision, gain stronger organizing skills, and deepen political analysis and strategy. We are working to cultivate an impactful and restorative online space for transformative connection that facilitates a place for people to learn, share, and explore possibilities that they may have never had the chance to before. Our current offerings include our Thriving Groups trainings, led by our training team to support groups working in local communities. People's Hub workshops are led by folks like you that often lead workshops in person and now want to lead their workshops online. And we have strategy clinics that are designed as peer strategy spaces and circles like this session today. Circles are an online conversation space hosted and facilitated by People's Hub, designed to bring together movement leaders, local change makers, and storytellers. Through these conversations, we will celebrate victories, learn from each other, grapple with big picture questions our movements are facing, and provide support for each other. So now I would like to turn it over to Siobhan.
Awesome, thank you, Joe. And a big thanks to People's Hub for this incredible partnership. I'm really excited to be on the call today to talk to you all about the New Economy Coalition's new policy toolkit, Pathways to a People's Economy. So grateful for everyone for being here and really grateful for all of the incredible partners that helped to make this happen. And again, my name is Siobhan. I'm a co-director of the New Economy Coalition, which I'll talk a little bit about here in just a moment. And just wanted to give a quick kind of grounding and overview of the agenda that we have for today. So we were really excited to be able to offer this webinar today to introduce you all and the public to Pathways to a People's Economy, which is a policy toolkit that a number of NEC members and partner organizations have been working on for the past few years. So we'll do an overview of the toolkit, provide a few details about how you can engage with the toolkit, the different types of content and pieces in there that you might use in your communities. Then we'll hear from Yassi Eskandari of Sustainable Economies Law Center about how you, as an individual or in your community or organization, how you can engage in policy change and the basics of the like hows and whys. Policy advocacy is critically important for us in this moment. And then we'll hear from Renee Hatcher, who is with the Illinois Coalition for Cooperative Advancement, who will talk quite a bit about some incredible organizing work that's been happening in Illinois around the Illinois Limited Worker Cooperative Association Act. And we'll hear about some of the organizing stories from the ground that's been happening there. And then of course, we'll have time for questions from you all. So definitely encourage folks, as you have questions throughout these presentations, please feel free to type them into the chat box. We'll hold questions until the end, but we'll try to get to as many as we can on this call and then can follow up with folks as well. Next slide. Awesome. And I know we've got a number of New Economy Coalition members on the call, so a big shout out to everyone here who's already on the call today. But for anyone who's not familiar with the New Economy Coalition, I'll take just a moment to give a quick overview. So NEC is a coalition of 210 organizations across the US working to build the power of the new economy movement. So in many ways, we're imagining and envisioning a new system or a new economy that really puts people and planet over profits, and that enables our communities to have collective ownership and control over the resources that we create and depend on. Next slide, please. And here's just a few of the NEC members. As I mentioned, we have over 200 member organizations. And in practice, a lot of our work on building that new economy really looks like the work that our members are doing on the ground. So that's a lot of incredible grassroots organizing and development in communities around building out worker ownership and cooperatives so that folks can have quality jobs in their neighborhoods and communities. It's a lot of work of residents organizing for community land trust and housing co-ops so that we can really see permanently affordable housing in our communities. A number of our members are working on community wealth building strategies and really finding innovative ways to help to collectively finance some of these new economy models. And then we also have a number of groups who are doing some incredible organizing work around climate and working to organize us and transition us away from fossil fuel dependence and towards climate resilience and restoration. So we have a number of incredible members who are working on this across the country to, again, kind of build that next system and that new economy that really puts people and planet first. And I do just want to note that, you know, we are looking to build that new system and that next system that can really work for us all. But in so many ways, all of this is really grounded on the rich history of cooperation and democratic governance that it has been in our communities for decades and for generations. Next slide, please. So many of our communities, as you can see even in just this quote from one of our members, so many of our communities have really been doing this work around building out cooperatives and mutual aid systems and respect and stewardship of the earth for years and for generations. So this is definitely something that is ingrained in a number of our communities and already in our ancestry. So I wanted to open it up to folks today on this call. I'd love for you to enter into the chat box. I think the prompt is already there of just what the new economy and the people's economy really means to you and how you see that play out and in practice in your communities. All right. Go ahead, Joe.
Decentralizing decision making. Thank you for that. Communities own and have control over their own capital. And inclusive sharing and open access to the economy. Returning profit to the people. autonomy on the community scale. Investing in community care and health over prisons and exploitation. Siobhan, you want to continue?
Amazing. Thank you all. There's so much great stuff coming in. Really appreciate you all sharing this. And definitely feel like the work that so many of us are doing, as we said before, in our communities is really built on this cooperation and support for one another. So thank you for sharing these. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. And folks can continue to add in here some of your examples. It's great to see so many from folks. And so you'll see on this next slide just a few more details, and a lot of this has already come up in the chat box, but NEC really sees the new economy as a vision for our future where people control their economies through deep democracy, cooperative, and public ownership, and a culture of mutual aid and respect for the earth. And so that looks like what most of you all have already lifted up of cooperatives and restorative justice and mutual aid networks, community solar, revolving loan funds, and public banks. So many of these incredible projects and the incredible community building that folks are already doing across our country and across the globe. Next slide. And so now I'll dig into a little bit deeper about, how the actual policy toolkit Pathways to a People's Economy came about. And NEC, as I mentioned, has about 210 organizations across the country. And every year we come together for our annual member meeting, where members are coming together to do peer learning, to share and educate and learn from one another, and to help to strategize and collaborate on future projects. And so in 2017, one of the big things that came from that meeting was the desire for folks to work more collaboratively on policy. So it was definitely a time where we were at in that moment in 2017, and in so many ways we still are really in the midst of a number of sweeping policy changes that have been incredibly harmful for our communities, harmful for our lives, and harmful for our planet. And so our members really felt that the time was right to build out a comprehensive document that could share with the world some of the incredible policy work that we were seeing in communities around new economy. And so folks were really wanting to provide tools to make concrete policy demands to advance a new economy, also wanting to build a narrative framework to influence campaigns on the ground, and to, in particular, amplify new economy policy organizing and wins that they saw happening in their communities and from other organizations across the country. Next slide, please. And so again, we were definitely in a time of seeing some incredibly harmful and still to this day seeing incredibly harmful policies that were coming out into the world that were damaging to our communities. But we also saw some incredible work that was in many ways kind of bursting forth through the cracks. That was helping to advance new and solidarity economies on the ground. And so there was great work happening around cooperative policy, including the Main Street Employee Ownership Act that passed. We saw a lot of work in different communities around things like participatory budgeting that was helping residents to be able to vote on and determine how to spend their city's dollars. There was great work happening across the country on public bank legislation, and then of course some federal legislation and proposals, including the Green New Deal, that were being lifted up over the past few years. Next slide. And so during all of these moments over the past few years, our members really felt like the time was now to try to introduce some of the, or amplify a lot of the incredible work that was happening with new economy policy. And so that's how Pathways to a People's Economy Policy Toolkit was born. Our members decided to divide into teams and to help to draft content in 4 key new economy areas, which were worker ownership, community-controlled housing, climate justice, and financial justice. Next slide, please. And so they spent several years drafting content, researching, talking with other organizations and communities, sharing the toolkit with folks for feedback and additional information, and came out with an incredible toolkit that has over 20 high-level policy demands, 70 detailed policy asks, and a number of case studies and organizing stories to really help folks to be able to advance new economy policy in their communities. And just a quick rundown of some of the things that you can use within the toolkit. You'll find sample policies and asks throughout the toolkit that you can use singularly or combine them as a whole to run policy campaigns and influence elected officials and candidates' platforms. You'll also find a number of one-pagers throughout the toolkit that can be used for lobby days to help to educate legislators and their staff on new economy policy. Then we've got several case studies that folks can use to provide inspiring stories of on-the-ground wins and the efforts that folks have been doing for policy change. And those, just a note on that, we've got a number of case studies in the toolkit already, and we're updating those over the months. So you'll see several in there right now, and we're excited to be able to add more of the incredible policy organizing stories that folks are contributing to this movement. And then we have a number of policy visions within each section that can be used to shape campaign narratives and to help inspire the public. Next slide. Cool, so now we'll take, just for the last couple of minutes of this section, a quick walkthrough of the policy toolkit. So folks can follow along with us. We'll be sharing the screen, or you can just go to peopleseconomy.org as well. Great, so it looks like we're right on the screen right now. So if we can just scroll down a little bit and we'll, you're here on the home page, and then we'll click on the green box that says Own Our Workplaces. So again, we have the 4 different issue areas that you can take a look at. Each are color coded. Owning Our Workplaces is the one that has representing the worker cooperative section. So here at the top, you'll see a number of different pieces that you can pull from, both as sort of a problem assessment for where we're at and what the landscape is, but then also a vision for the future. And you can scroll down just a little bit. And then here you can also download advocacy one-pagers. So if folks are interested in having a one-pager that you can hand to a legislator or hand to their staff or community members that you're working with, you can download those there. You can also click on each of the sections. So we have the overarching sort of broad policy demands that are listed here. And then as you start to click on the individual ones, you can get more detailed policy asks. So we'll go ahead and click on the first one, develop education and technical assistance programs. So you'll see here the detailed policy asks, and then you can click on read more to go ahead and take you to an even more detailed page that may be helpful for folks, that goes into even more detail on each policy ask and provides additional examples and links that you can follow to learn more about each of these policy pieces. And then we'll just scroll up to the top. We'll do just a couple more things here with the screen share. We'll click on the case studies so folks can take a look at some of these. And again, we have some awesome, incredible, inspiring organizing case studies already here on the website. Folks doing some incredible community wealth building work in Boston, public banking happening in California, New York with some awesome climate justice work. And then we've got housing and real estate cooperative work happening in the Bay. And then of course, who we'll hear from later in Illinois with their incredible co-op policy work. So you can click on these to get more detail. And then the last thing we'll take a look at is the Get Involved section. Just want to highlight this. This is a place where we really want to be able to hear from you about some of the emergent policy issues that folks are working on. We know that our policy landscape is changing day by day, and that we are constantly responding, in particular in this time in our country and in the globe, responding to a number of crises. So we really want to hear from folks about the policy solutions that your organizations are working on, or policy resources that you might have. So you can submit those in this section as well. And that will be it for the toolkit screen share. So we can go ahead and come off of that slide. Awesome. And then if folks have questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, but I will go ahead and wrap this up. We've got a number of incredible folks that are going to be talking today, so I'll pass it back to the People's Hub. Oh, Joe, looks like we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Great.
Good.
So on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 not being very connected currently, And 5, being very connected. How much are you currently connected to both building a new economy and the issue areas in the toolkit? And you can share your number in the chat. Great, a lot of 5s, some 2s, some people in the middle, 3.5, 4. I think I just saw a 6 scroll up. So I think you all will be in for a treat for Yasi that will talk about policy advocacy.
All right. I guess that's my cue. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. It's great to see how many people are on the call today. Again, I'm Yasi Eskandari. I'm Policy Director at the Sustainable Economies Law Center, and I'm zooming in from Oakland, California. And next slide. I wanted to talk to you all today about why NEC has gone through all this effort that Siobhan was mentioning in the introduction. And I believe it's because the same reason I support policy work and I think it's important. It's because it can, in many cases, really further the work that we're trying to accomplish in powerful ways. I went a little bit wild with my slide, but I did want to demonstrate with this slide that there's just so many different impacts that you can have through policy advocacy. Generally, it can be used as either a carrot or a stick, meaning it can be used to incentivize or to disincentivize particular activities. And for example, you could introduce decision makers and the public to new or innovative or existing and otherwise non-dominant social and economic models like those that many NEC members are trying to advocate for. It can help to remove barriers to those activities and incentivize those activities. And even more simply, it can just be used to formalize and recognize existing activities that we're already doing, existing models that are already growing, and also community-based solutions that we have, as Siobhan mentioned in her introduction, that we have been participating in for centuries. But by doing this, by engaging on the level of policy, we'll be recognizing and validating these solutions that we know work and facilitating their replication and also their success. Next slide, please. So what is policy advocacy? It can often be a vague term and it can also be intimidating, but we at the Sustainable Economies Law Center, and I believe NEC as well, really wants to demonstrate that anyone can be a policymaker. And in fact, those people who are most impacted by an issue are in the best position to propose the solutions to those problems. So when I was preparing this presentation, I found a definition of policy advocacy that I really liked. This is from the International Center for Policy Advocacy. Policy advocacy is the process of negotiating and mediating a dialogue through which influential networks, opinion leaders, and ultimately decision makers take ownership of your ideas, evidence, and proposals and subsequently act upon them. I think that particularly in the context of the New Economy Coalition work and the work of its members, our ideas tend to be non-dominant or non-mainstream or otherwise innovative. And so I think the definition of success, which is you have achieved success when decision makers present your ideas as their own, was a particularly fitting definition as well. But let's get a little bit more specific about what policy advocacy actually is. I have 5 minutes left. Policy advocacy oftentimes looks like legislation on the state or local level or federal levels, but that's kind of what we might think of when we think of policy advocacy. But I really wanted to stress that it's not just about getting a win or having a successful campaign. There's also a lot of work that needs to be done before, during, and after a policy win. There's a lot of things you can do beforehand. For example, meeting with elected officials and government departments and agencies to discuss their agenda with them and to discuss their strategies, and also to find common ground and express how your work and your vision aligns with their priorities. And then after a policy win, you still have to clear the major hurdle of implementation and designs, sometimes of public programs. And it would really be beneficial to have the implementation phase in mind throughout your entire advocacy process. And of course, there's also budget appropriations, making sure that the programs or initiatives that you're advocating for have resources. Next slide. Let me just check that we're on the same slide. Sorry, yeah. So one more slide. Great, thank you. Yeah, so there are many different ways to make a case for policy change. And policy advocacy is just one tool among many. Next slide. It's beneficial to take a more holistic approach, even if you have a low-hanging fruit, or if you're advocating for something that might take decades for you to actually get passed. I wanted to recognize that there's so many other important strategies that communities are engaging in that are part of the bigger picture. And in fact, policy change can often be all the more profound if it's actually coordinated and sequenced and embedded in larger social movements like community organizing and protest and strategic storytelling, etc. Next slide. So we had a question for you. What kinds of policy advocacy are you engaging in, and what are some lessons learned that you would want to share with the group? You can type your answers into the chat box.
And I know we had a lot of folks connecting with us after the start. So if right now you're going, where's the chat box? Look for the button that says chat in your Zoom toolbar and click that, and you'll find the question on the screen and also in the chat box.
Great, and I'm seeing a lot of awesome answers coming into the chat to this question of tips and experience from policy advocacy, from power mapping to relationship building, working on ballot initiatives, a lesson of proceeding until apprehended, legislation and community resiliency building, regenerative systems. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So this will be my last slide since we're short on time, but I just wanted to mention that there are a lot of lessons that I have learned over the years advocating at the Law Center, Sustainable Economies Law Center. And I would say, of course, these are context-specific tips, but I think I found them, these are the lessons I've learned from my experience. I would say working in coalition is extremely powerful and can make your efforts all the more impactful, especially when you can reach across the aisle or work across silos that don't typically collaborate. I would say ensuring that your stakeholders are also engaging in the work. So if you're trying to advocate for a particular group of people, talk to those people. Make sure that what you're doing is actually what they would find valuable and what they would call that their priorities. In best case scenario, you'd actually loop them in and have them lead your policy efforts. Related to that is using real life stories. I think that, of course, data and actual legislation, all those things are important pieces of policy advocacy, but I would say in my experience, the times where I feel like I've been able to make the most compelling arguments is when we've had real life stories, real people coming and meeting with decision makers and expressing how an issue has impacted them in their lives.
Thank you
really
so much.
That conversation with the heart.
Thank you.
Okay. Is that my cue to stop?
So we have a poll that we would like you to answer.
Like 8 minutes over time. It's time for other person.
Yeah, so I was thinking I would just end it here, Joe, without going through the
Great.
section, but we'll have this information then,
Great, thank you.
so we can just skip that.
And so the result was up to 25%. And we are going to head into breakouts. And in the breakout, we are going to ask you to engage in a couple of questions. What policy campaigns or issues are you hoping to engage? How does policy advocacy support your base building and creating a new solidarity alternative creation work on the ground? And what support would be helpful for you in your work? Jean?
Yeah, Jess, if you could come off mute and just explain folks for a minute how these will work.
Yeah, of course. So we're going to give you all a chance to talk with each other now and applying what we've been hearing from these awesome folks sharing stories so far. So you're going to notice a box pop up on your screen that's inviting you into a breakout room. Jean's getting those set up for you all right now. And you'll just have to click to join that room. So please make sure you click join. And once you're in there, just wait for a moment. It might take another moment for some other folks to join you. We're going to have groups of about 5 or 6, and we've got a lot of folks on the call today, which is really, really amazing. And if you have any challenges or tech issues, you can click the little help button that's going to show up in your breakout room. So please try not to leave the room unless you're having some serious tech issues. We'll also send these questions back out to you with an announcement. And then we're going to ask you to answer on the slides. So we'll be sending you a link directly as well so that you can help us actually generate this really great list in the slides themselves. So we're going to put that in the chat now. Just go ahead and click through, and they should be editable to you. So we're joining, is that slide 33, Jean? Great. So join us on slide 33, and we're going to get you set up in your breakout rooms in just a moment.
Okay, and just a note for our hosts, if you are one of our hosts and you get an invitation, just please don't accept it. Okay, we're gonna start those rooms now.
You all have about 7 minutes in rooms together, and we will let you know when to come back. Welcome back, folks. You're coming back from your breakout groups. Feel free to keep adding your thoughts and responses to the slides. Now, there was a lot of us in there, so the document's a little slow right now. You can also share your responses in the chat, and we'll make sure to capture those to share out with everyone later as well.
Great. So just to
Wait, Joe,
Joe,
sorry. They've got 40 more seconds.
Okay.
Hold on. So some folks have come back early. You can keep adding to the slides, and everyone else should be with us in about a half a minute.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome back. It looks like folks are being brought back into the main room. Sorry, I know sometimes this can be a little bit abrupt. As you're coming back into the main room, please be sure to put yourself back on mute. Now, the rooms were ended. Sorry, we made you come back, even if you weren't done. Sorry about that. You can keep adding your ideas to the Google Doc as we're reconnecting. And then just a reminder, you'll have to open the chat box again. Definitely went by quickly. I'm going to pass you back to Joe, but feel free to keep adding.
Thank you, Jean. I hope your conversation was fruitful, and I just want to read a couple of the things that you all captured in the slides. So what policy campaigns or issues are you hoping to engage? Someone said, I'm working globally on the framing of an economics that supports all the things we are talking about here, including the shift in power from global corporations to local communities. Education to shift policymakers thinking away from classical economics toward new economics and redefining prosperity outside of those parameters. All right, so you can keep adding to the chat, and now we are going to hear from a case study of on-the-ground work from Renee. And as you are listening to Renee, journal about how what Renee is doing in her community relates to your work at home and whatever questions you have for the Q&A. So Renee.
Great. Hey, everybody. So my name's Renee Hatcher. I am the director of the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic at UIC John Marshall Law School, but also a member of the Illinois Coalition for Cooperative Advancement, which I'm going to talk to you about today. I could talk about this for a very long time. I'm going to try to do it in 8 minutes. We'll see how it goes. Obviously happy to the extent that we have time to answer questions afterwards. Slide, please. So what I'm hoping to talk to you all about today is one of our recent victories, or our win, more or less, for a new worker co-op entity, what that process was like, why we actually decided to kind of take on this campaign over the last about year and a half or so, and more or less how we went about it, some reflections that I personally have. I cannot speak for the entire coalition, but also hopefully to give you a sense of at least my experiences in coalition and what that has been like. Slide, please. So I have been involved more or less, like the journey of trying to get this worker co-op bill has been a long one. And it's more or less happened in stages in which there were individuals who have been working on this for a long time. So while I say we've been working on this for a year and a half, there have been organizations and individuals, certainly here in the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois, who've been pushing for a change to the co-op law in Illinois for a long time. Specifically, the Illinois Worker Co-op Alliance, I want to just shout out to them. They have been working to pass a law similar to the one that we got passed for a number of different years, I would say, like starting back in 2014. And really a culmination of things happened in the last year or so to allow us a group of people who came together in coalition to actually get this passed. I included a number of the organizations and worker co-ops who are a part of the ICCA, the Illinois Cooperative or Coalition for Cooperative Advancement, just to make sure that you all know who I'm referring to. But we are a loose coalition. We're not formalized. But a lot of my first experience with the coalition and a lot of some of the initial steps that we took started about 2 years ago when we started to have gatherings to discuss what the current worker co-op ecosystem looked like in the city of Chicago specifically. And so we had a meeting, we kind of talked about some of what we knew to be true or what existed. We invited in as many stakeholders who we knew were either working on worker co-ops or champions of worker co-ops, as well as worker co-ops themselves. There also were policymakers there as well, but it was really kind of an initial conversation. Out of that conversation, we talked about the need to be intentional about building a worker co-op ecosystem. And so what we then did was to go about doing one-on-ones with as many worker co-ops as we could identify, and to get a sense of what their experiences have been, what they found to be some of their challenges and obstacles, and put all that information together. And ultimately, my clinic was tasked with putting together a white paper or a policy report specifically about this. Next slide. So one of the things that came out of that policy paper were a set of recommendations. There's a few things that we heard over and over again. Obviously, one was like just access to capital for starter worker co-ops, which I think tends to be probably a big problem in all of our communities as worker co-ops are looking to form, not having access to the kind of money they might need to either buy space or get equipment that they need to get going. But then the other thing that we kept running up against, which I experienced this, like a lot of us in the coalition experienced this, whenever we would have policy meetings and invite in folks to talk about worker co-op development and try to identify resources for worker co-ops, one of the things that we heard both from sometimes the different governmental offices as well as foundations was the fact that Illinois law didn't recognize worker co-ops. The fact that, well, we're unclear about, more or less there just wasn't the kind of education that was necessary about co-ops generally. And one thing that they would say in particular is like, well, Illinois doesn't necessarily recognize worker co-ops in law, and therefore we don't think this is a thing that we can get into, or we can't necessarily commit funds to do this or grant funding. That was one thing that we continued to hear. And so part of the challenge became, it's like, okay, well, we're going to go change the law, basically. And there was a group of both worker co-ops, incubators, worker centers, different stakeholders that essentially kind of came together to talk about how we could change the law more or less to support worker co-ops moving forward. And what came out of an initial meeting of that coalition was basically one thing that we can do is to pass a worker co-op entity that supports worker co-ops, that does all the things that we want it to do, that the law currently doesn't. In Illinois, we currently have a Cooperative Corporation Act. It was not a good fit for a lot of our starter worker co-ops and worker co-ops generally. There are issues in terms of employment. So for example, people who don't necessarily have work authorization would have issues if they were a worker member who were classified as an employee within a cooperative corporation. So that was one challenge. And then also with our Cooperative Corporation Act, you could not include the word cooperative in your business name unless you use that particular act originally. So these are all things that we wanted to change. So we set off in terms of both talking about what that law could look like, as well as convening about how we might get it done. And part of it was following some of the recommendations that came out of the initial policy paper. Slide, please. So as a part of this process, just so you all know, a lot of what we did initially was do mapping. So we could do those one-on-one sorts of interviews with worker co-ops to really understand what did we need to write in this law to make it a good fit for everybody, or the folks who are actually doing worker co-op development. Slide. So these are the things that we decided were most important. We wanted to, one, center the needs of oppressed communities. Here in Chicago, the majority of new worker co-ops are based in communities of color, Latinx communities, immigrant communities, Black communities. We know that generally it tends to be women who are leading the way in terms of just our new worker owners in worker co-ops that are developing. So we wanted to make sure that we centered the needs of oppressed communities and make sure that they were, that whatever we wrote, they would have access to in building the kinds of worker co-ops that they wanted to build. The other thing was that we wanted to make it very easy for sweat equity contributions. Again, that goes back to that point that I was saying around the ways in which the Cooperative Corporation Act was just simply not a good fit for a lot of our co-ops. A lot of them are startups, they're micro enterprises, there's just a couple of worker members, and they don't necessarily have a lot of capital at the outset, so they're working to get the business or the co-op off the ground. We wanted the law to explicitly recognize worker co-ops. So we really wanted to do a worker co-op bill kind of specifically. The bill that we did also allows for multi-stakeholder co-ops, but it requires that workers have a controlling say in the co-op itself. So we enshrined basically cooperative principles and the worker co-op recognition in it. Finally, the other thing I wanted just to mention was that we wanted to allow for additional financing opportunities and options. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Slide, please. So the bill is most like worker co-ops, like kind of mixed with a limited cooperative association or LLC, right? So that makes it very flexible. People can use it the ways in which they want, but we wrote in certain provisions to make sure that workers always maintain control of these kinds of businesses. Slide. This is just a chart that we use to educate some of the legislators to try to win them over to our side. I guess the other thing I should say is that the bill that we wrote ultimately did get passed unanimously in both houses of the Illinois legislature, signed by the governor. And so we had very dedicated folks who were down in Springfield almost every day, certainly every week, talking to legislators. There were a couple of things that we had, a couple of folks we had to neutralize, but we were creating materials, and a lot of which I'm using in this presentation to educate lawmakers to make sure that they were going to vote yes. Slide. Okay, so the entity, right, allows for businesses to assert themselves as worker co-ops. It enshrines cooperative values into the business form, talks about basically why worker co-ops are a good thing and everybody should be excited about this. And then finally, also, I wanted to mention this thing. One of the things that we wrote into the bill was that it allows cooperatives to raise capital without the burden of securities registration, which was an important thing for us because to the extent that our worker co-ops are looking for investors, they tend to be like local to their communities and neighborhoods. They tend to get little amounts of money from a lot of people, and we didn't want them to have to pay and go through the process, the lengthy process of trying to go through securities registration, which can be costly and it'll take a long time to be able to allow folks to invest. And so we were able to write an exemption into the law specifically for worker co-ops that use this entity. And then finally, you know, more or less what we wrote creates access for low to moderate income entrepreneurs. Slide. Okay, there's a couple of things I just have to mention before we wrap up, right? So one, we had a victory. Obviously, that feels good. It passed, signed by the governor this summer and went into effect January 1 of this year. A couple of things that I wanted to mention, because a lot of times once we win, we get really excited and we just want to celebrate. One of the wonderful things that we did that I thought was really helpful and important, we actually did a survey kind of assessment after we got the bill passed. Our communications committee, which did like amazing work, both in terms of like some of the materials I've shown you in this presentation, but they put together like a really fantastic survey for all of the co-op members, and we had meetings to kind of debrief and assess what we did. The final thing I want to say is about implementation. We've had to continue to work as a coalition to actually get the bill implemented. So right now, we've been going back and forth with the Secretary of State to create new forms to actually allow folks to use the new entity. So tomorrow we're actually doing a press conference. A group of new worker co-ops are going to go and file together and do a little press conference as a part of showing why this was important and how we're using the law.
That's so amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Great. So now is the time that we are going to hear your questions, and the first. If you can put your questions in the chat. And one of the questions that we have is for Siobhan. And we are going to follow up on these questions and get them answered and send them out to you. So please keep them coming in the chat. And what is upcoming is part 2 to this series, Building Pathways to a People's Economy, Restoring Our Planet, which happens on April 2nd at 3 p.m. And this one is going to have a strategy clinic attached. And you can keep up to date with this series at peopleshub.org, as well as New Economy Coalition. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our amazing speakers.
Awesome, thanks everyone. And yes, please peep the toolkit and let us know any additional questions you have. You can check out peopleseconomy.org and keep those questions coming, because we'll do our best to get to questions when we do the follow-up after this. And a big thanks to Renee and Yasi and People's Hub for all of their partnership and work on this. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks to you. It was terrific. Really terrific. Yeah.